Welcome aboard. I'm Jim, the assistant supervisor. The burly man sitting in front of me extended his grease-stained hand across the desk. Alan, I replied, leaning forward to shake the offered hand. We're very excited to have you here, Alan. Now, before I give you a tour of the facility, I just need you to fill out some paperwork, Jim said, reaching over to grab a small stack of papers he had waiting for me. It's mostly just basic employment forms, tax stuff, contact info, that sort of thing. He handed the stack to me with one hand, while he used the other to pull a pen out of the drawer. After I accepted the papers, he placed the pen on the desk and slid it over to me. I'm gonna leave you to it, Jim said, gesturing at the papers with his chin as he got up and began to leave his office. I've got a few things I need to check on before we begin the tour. If you need anything, just ask Carol. He pointed at his receptionist. Once he left the office, I picked up the pen and began filling out the papers. It was the usual paperwork you'd expect to fill out when you start a new job. At least it was, until I came to the last two forms. The first was a non-disclosure agreement, and the second was a complacency procedure agreement. I know what a non-disclosure agreement is. I was just surprised to see that I needed to sign one to work at a water treatment plant. It was the complacency procedure agreement that had me confused. I had never heard of such a thing. I would have pulled out my phone and looked it up on Google, but I was asked to surrender my phone when I entered the plant. I got the impression security at the facility was very tight. I really needed the job, so there weren't many things that would keep me from signing the agreement. I just wanted to know what it was before I signed it. After mulling it over in my head for a few moments, I decided to ask Carol about it. Excuse me, Carol, I said, picking up the form and walking over to her desk. Can I ask you something? Sure thing, hun, she replied, turning away from her computer to give me her full attention. I dangled the form from my fingers so she could see it. What is a complacency procedure? She sighed in annoyance, but not at me. I take it Jim didn't go over the forms with you before running off and leaving you on your own. I nodded my head. Typical, she said. The complacency procedure is like a special type of exit interview in case you ever decide to leave the company. You are going to learn a lot about how the plant operates while working here, and the owners don't want you to spill any trade secrets if you quit or get fired. The procedure is designed to ensure that doesn't happen. It's nothing to worry about. Everyone here has signed one. You won't be allowed to work here if you don't sign it. She waited a moment while I processed everything she had told me before speaking again. Does that answer your question? Yeah, I guess it does. Thanks, I said, turning and walking back into Jim's office where I signed the form and waited for him to return. You all done? Jim bellowed from behind me a few minutes later. Yep, I said, waiting for him to take a seat before handing him the forms. He flipped through them quickly, stopping when he came to the complacency procedure form. I considered asking him about the procedure, but decided against it. The form was signed. I was committed to the job at this point. Excellent, he said, standing up. Now we can get started. Follow me. Jim walked out of his office. The forms I'd filled out clutched in his hands. I got up and followed him. As he walked by Carol's desk, he handed her my paperwork and asked her to file them. How much do you know about the facility? Jim asked, holding the door to the facility open for me. Not much, I admitted, walking through the doorway. I live over in August County, and a new water treatment plant in a neighbouring county isn't exactly headline news. I guess it wouldn't be, Jim said, taking the lead down the corridor. Truth be told, we tried our best to keep the plant out of the news when we took over water treatment duties for Howard County. Why is that? I asked. Given the nature of the unique way the plant works, the people in charge wanted to draw as little attention to the facility as possible. Is that why you hire people from different counties? When I applied, one of the requirements listed for the job was that I not live in Howard County. According to the application, anyone that lived in or had visited the country in the past 3 years was eligible for employment. You'd think they want to support the local economy by hiring people who live there, but I wasn't going to question it. I was just happy they were willing to give me, a guy with no experience in the water treatment industry, a chance to prove himself. That's one of the reasons. Jim smiled and then changed the subject. This is our first stop, he said, leading me through one of the doors that lined the hallway. The back wall of the room was filled from floor to ceiling with all sorts of meters and gauges. Standing before the wall was an older gentleman dressed in coveralls and holding a clipboard. This is the monitoring station. Jim gestured at the wall with an open hand. And this is Buddy, he said, placing a hand on the older man's shoulder. Alan, I said, reaching out and shaking Buddy's offered hand. He smiled and inclined his head in a greeting. Buddy is our first line of defense against any potential malfunctions, Jim explained as Buddy went back to reading the meters and making notes on his clipboard. Our filters can be temperamental at times, and it is Buddy's job to warn us before something like that gets out of hand. As a filter technician, Buddy is the most important person you will be working with, so try and stay on his good side, he joked as we left the room and returned to the hallway. What were those oddly shaped gauges along the top of the wall? I asked Jim as we walked to our next destination. They didn't look like they could possibly be real. They looked like something you'd see in a Dr. Seuss book. Those are unique to our filtration system, Jim replied. Once you see the filters, they will make a lot more sense. I was about to ask another question about the dials when I was interrupted by a deep, lowing sound coming from one of the exit doors we passed. I looked at Jim to gauge his reaction, but he didn't seem concerned about it and kept on walking. So I did the same. My first thought was that a cow from a neighbouring cattle ranch had wandered onto the property, but I didn't see how that was possible considering the treatment plant was surrounded by a chain link fence that was topped with barbed wire. You could easily mistake the place for a prison. My curiosity eventually got the better of me. Was that a cow? I asked, jabbing my thumb over my shoulder at the door. It was, Jim answered. The county owns the ranch next door. It makes things a lot easier for us and helps keep people from asking too many questions about what we do here. Aren't you worried about the runoff from the ranch polluting the water? If they weren't, they should be. I saw at least 300 or 400 cows wandering around the large open field that bordered the plant when I drove by. That's a lot of animal waste that can easily make its way into the water system, especially since it was so close to the treatment facility. You could run raw sewage through this plant, and what would come out would be the cleanest drinking water in the country. I know this for a fact, because we occasionally do it. What? I blurted out. Jim stopped and turned to face me. Running this facility isn't cheap. Processing waste overflow from neighbouring states helps us offset our operating costs. I know it sounds disgusting, but once you understand the process, it won't seem as shocking. I had a million questions running through my mind, but I didn't ask any of them. I decided to wait until the filtration process had been explained to me before I said anything else. Here we are, Jim announced as we reached the end of the hall. Behind him was a large metal door. In the centre of it was a wheel that had to be turned to unlock it, like the ones you find on a military ship. Another security measure, Jim said, after seeing the puzzled look on my face. From this point on, the facility is made entirely out of steel. He knocked on the wall. The engineers used modern battleships as inspiration when designing the hold tanks for the plants. Plants? I asked. Is there more than one water treatment facility in the county? Jim didn't answer. He just smiled and said, "After you," as he pulled the heavy door open. I stepped through the narrow opening into a room that was lined with bright yellow environmental suits. On the far wall was another door like the one we had entered through. A million more questions ran through my mind, but they all fled when I was startled by Jim slamming the door shut and spinning the wheel, locking us inside the tiny room. "Grab a suit," he said, pulling one off the wall and starting to put it on over his clothes. "We can't go any further without them." I grabbed a suit and started to shrug into it. Once Jim finished putting his suit on, he came over and made sure that I had put mine on correctly. "Your suit must remain waterproof at all times. I cannot stress this enough. If it ever tears while you're in one of the holding tanks, you need to get the hell out of there as quickly as possible." Jim's voice was muffled by the suit. "Okay," I nodded. I was beginning to think taking this job was a bad idea. Now I was starting to understand why it paid so well. "Now, before you can enter the holding tanks, you need to walk through the decontamination shower. This is done by walking through that door." Jim pointed to the door opposite the one we had entered. "Once you close the door, the showers will kick on as soon as you proceed down the hall. It's all automated, so you don't have to do anything except walk. The system only allows one person in the shower at a time, so I will go first. When that light comes on," Jim pointed to the green bulb above the door, "that means I've made it to the other side and it is clear for you to enter. Any questions?" Jim asked as he unlocked the door. I shook my head, despite the growing number of questions I wanted to ask. "See you on the other side," he said, closing the door. After Jim shut the door, the red light next to the green one lit up. I waited until it went off and the green light came on before opening the door and stepping into the narrow hallway. Taking a deep breath, I shut the door behind me and began walking down the hall. Before I finished my first step, the shower heads in the ceiling came to life, dousing me with fluid. I made my way to the opposite side, trying to keep a steady pace. I didn't know what the shower was supposed to protect me from, and I didn't want to take any chances by rushing through it. When I reached the door at the end of the hall, the shower was cut off. Before I could reach out and open the door, it swung open to reveal two people. One of them was Jim. "This is Bill," Jim said, introducing the man beside him. "He's been working overtime while waiting for us to hire another filter tech." "That's an understatement," Bill laughed. "I practically live here at the moment." I stepped through the doorway into a wide open space with a vaulted ceiling that must have been at least 30 feet high. In the center of the room, there were 3 large dome structures, each as big as a small house with large pipes coming out from the bottom of them. I greeted Bill with a handshake, the bulky gloves of our suits making it awkward. "Once you've completed your certification training, Bill will be your hands-on trainer," Jim explained to me. To Bill, he said, "Thanks, Bill. You can go prep the facilitator for Filter 1. Bill turned to leave, but before he did, he placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "Don't worry, man. The plant looks a lot worse than it really is." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I turned to Jim to see if he might elaborate on that comment. He didn't. "Your suit has about 45 minutes worth of air," Jim said, pointing to the small canister attached to my hip. "Fresh air canisters are kept in those cabinets." He pointed to a small shelved unit off in the distance. "There's one in every corner of this room. It'll be one of your responsibilities to ensure that those cabinets are fully stocked at all times and that all empty canisters are shipped out to be refilled." I nodded to show that I understood. "Are you ready to see the filter?" Jim asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," I responded. At this point, I didn't know what to expect, but I was committed to seeing this through. I needed the job and couldn't afford to back out now. I followed Jim over to a door in the closest dome structure. Painted upon the side of the dome were the letters FIL-TER. Below that was a large number 1. Jim didn't say a word as he spun the metal wheel, unlocking the door. Once the door was opened, he motioned for me to enter first. I stepped through the doorway. What I saw defied belief. I was expecting a network of pools and pipes along with a complex filtration system. Instead, I saw a concrete room, in the center of which was a large creature that vaguely resembled a deformed anemone, if an anemone could grow to be the size of a bus. I turned and faced Jim, expecting him to start laughing at the joke he had just played on me. But he just held me with his gaze, obviously waiting to see if I would freak out or not. "That's the filter?" I asked, pointing at it. "It is," he replied. "To be more precise, it is a fungiform intelligent lifeform transdimensional environmental regulator, filter for short. I often refer to them as the water treatment plants, since they sort of look like flowers." "Intelligent? Are you saying that thing knows we are here?" I turned back around and leaned my head back to see if I could find anything that resembled a head or a face on the top of it. "Can it understand what we say?" "I'd say it is semi-intelligent," Jim replied. "It hasn't shown any indication it could understand us, but it does possess a cunning that rivals most predators." "Is it safe to be this close to it?" "As long as you have your suit on, you aren't in any danger. You could go up and touch it if you'd like." "I'll pass," I said. "So, how does it filter the water?" I asked as curiosity started to replace my disbelief. "It doesn't filter the water. It produces it," Jim answered. "How?" Before Jim could answer, Bill walked through the doorway leading a cow. "Perfect timing," Jim said to Bill. To me, he said, "We think the filters are transdimensional creatures. That means they exist in 2 dimensions at once, ours and another one. Our best guess is that the water it produces comes from this other dimension." "How do you get it to produce water when you want it to? It doesn't look like it's in the mood." The tentacles that surrounded his body seemed to be limp and inactive. "That's what the cow is for. We call it a facilitator. Once the filter ingests the cow, it'll come alive like a sprinkler and fill this room in a matter of hours." The cow mooed when it was mentioned. The sound did not go unnoticed by the filter. Its tentacles came to life as it shifted its body towards the animal. The strange creature's excitement could be felt as vibrations in the air. Before the cow could respond to the threat, one of the filter's tentacles blasted it with a jet of water. The cow turned to run, but suddenly stopped. It stood there, dripping wet, oblivious to the large creature looming over it. Even when it turned its head and looked right at the filter, all it did was moo. When an opening formed in the filter's body, spilling forth a tangled mess of writhing tendrils to engulf the cow, it didn't struggle. It went to its death without a struggle. A few moments after the cow was pulled into the base of the filter, the tentacles along the top of its body began to swell and undulate before spurting forth a torrent of water, one after the other. It was impossible to avoid getting sprayed. I prayed my suit didn't have a hole in it. I saw what the water did to the cow. That's our cue to leave, Jim said, motioning towards the door. I didn't need to be told twice. I was the first one out of the dome, followed by Jim and then Bill, who closed the door and sealed it. Before I could say anything, Jim held up his hand to stop me. Let's get out of these suits and head back to my office. There is a lot to go over, and I'd rather not do it standing around in these uncomfortable suits. I couldn't argue with that. I followed Jim back to the chemical shower. When it was my turn to walk through it, I stayed inside it longer than was necessary to ensure I was properly decontaminated. Where did that thing come from? I asked after Jim had taken a seat behind his desk. Well, that's a long story, he said, opening a drawer and pulling out a large manual and slapping it on his desk. That's what this is for. He placed his hand on the book. Everything you need to know about the filters, where they came from, why they are here, can be found in this book. I picked up the book and read the title. The Old One Accords. Underneath the title was a string of gibberish that looked like a bunch of letters and apostrophes. It was something like Feng Lui Mgnauf, Cthulhu Relay, Wagnalo Fugnan. Is this supposed to be some sort of training manual? I asked. What if I told you that a race of ancient deities from beyond time and space had awoken and had been secretly subjugating the planet for years, and that by the time the leaders of the world found out about it, it was already too late? Jim's question sounded like the plot of a bad science fiction movie. Up until an hour ago, I would have assumed you were on drugs, I replied. After what I've seen today, I'd give you the benefit of the doubt and hear you out before I decide if you were crazy or not. Well, it's true. But don't take my word for it. Read the book. It's all in there. What does any of this have to do with working here at the plant? As part of the surrender agreement the government made with the Old Ones, every state has to give up one county to act as the seat of power for the overseers, a place where they could continue to manipulate the world without the world knowing it. The filters are for them. The water they produce keeps the local populace compliant and ignorant of the creatures that act as their friends and neighbors. It also keeps them from questioning things when someone happens to go missing, if you know what I mean. No, I don't know what you mean. What are you talking about? I leaned forward, placing my forearms on the edges of his desk. The overseers have a very specific diet. Jim paused to let this comment sink in. Thankfully, they don't have to eat that often. You mean they eat? Jim nodded. I found it best not to dwell on it. I only mention it because I want you to know what's at stake if you decide to work here. That is why you have to read the manual. Once you're done reading it, you can become a certified acolyte and you won't have to worry about what goes on in Howard County. Acolyte? It's just a fancy title used to refer to those in their employ. Don't let that turn you off. We rarely use the term on the job. What if I decide the job isn't right for me? Allow me to answer that. The voice that came from behind me made my skin crawl. It was wet and phlegmy. The speaker spat the words out, clearly not used to speaking English or articulating words in general. I was too afraid to turn around, knowing the thing behind me wasn't human. It couldn't be. Of course, Overseer Orazath, Jim said, standing to greet his boss. After he spoke, Overseer Orazath placed his hand on my shoulder. At least, I thought it was a hand, until I felt something cold and wet seep through my shirt. I froze, doing my best to not show my unease. Alan, he said, pausing as he leaned in close to my ear. What is known cannot be forgotten. If you choose to leave, I'll have to hold you to the complacency agreement you signed. His breath smelled like a festering wound. "What does that mean?" I asked, unable to keep the tremble out of my voice. "It means if you're not an acolyte for this company, you'll become Howard County's newest resident. At least you'll be a resident until your services are needed in other ways." Other ways? I wasn't asking a question. I just happened to be thinking out loud, remembering what Jim had told me about the residents of Howard County. "Yes, Alan, other ways," Overseer Orazath answered. "To put it bluntly, as your kind likes to say, if you're not with the company, you're with the cattle." "Can't you hear the sirens, Ethan?" Gemma asked from her cot, looking up at me with terror in her eyes. "Why are they so loud? Why won't they stop?" "It's okay, they're not going to hurt you," I tell her, wiping her forehead with a damp cloth. "You're safe now. They can't get to you." But even as I say the words, I doubt them. We both know what happens when you see them, when the sirens get into your head and you can't get them out. Gemma tosses and turns on the cot, fidgeting and groaning, only half conscious. I know she doesn't have long, and I look over to Dad's rifle leaning up against the stove. I won't let it come to that. I won't let them take her. It's my fault, really. I shouldn't have let her go off on her own. I mean, Christ, she's only 15, but I thought she'd be okay. She knew the rules like any of us. You stay inside whenever you can. You don't make a noise. You keep to the houses and the buildings in the town, and you stay away from the outskirts. And you never, ever go in the woods. She knew that. I knew that. It was practically engraved into our memories by Dad. So I thought she'd be okay if we split up the next time we went looking for supplies. I had been halfway across town, looking through the picked-over remains of a gas station convenience store, when I first heard the sirens. They sounded distant, like they always do, and the automated wail warped and crackled like a corrupted audio file. In the silence of the mostly dead town, the silence seemed deafening, and when they didn't stop after the first 5 seconds like they usually do when they test the air, I knew something was wrong. I guess I broke one of the rules too, when I ran out from the store and broke into a run towards the abandoned mall where Gemma had gone. Dad had always said to never, ever let your emotions control you when you're out on a scavenging run, that it clouds your judgment. I didn't care. I could hear the haunting sirens warble through the silence of the empty streets, and I knew that they had found her somehow. All I could think about was getting to her before they did. The sirens were deafening by the time I burst through the shattered glass door of the abandoned mall, the same few notes repeating over and over, yet getting deeper and more twisted with each second. I knew they were using their sirens for the hunt, zeroing in on their prey's location, and I could only run a little bit faster as I scanned the deserted shops for any signs of my sister. I saw the creature before I saw Gemma. It wasn't the first time I'd seen a siren head, but it was definitely the closest I had ever been to one. I had rounded the corner of the mall's main hallway and almost ran straight into it, and frantically skidded to a halt behind an overturned kiosk stall. If it had been looking in my direction, it would have seen me for sure, but mercifully, it was facing the other way. The thing barely fit underneath the roof and had to bend its bony frame, easily around 20 feet high. Its features were almost identical to the one that had killed Dad, with the same dried, grey, mummified skin clinging to a slender, bony frame. Its limbs were long and spindly, yet its hands split into razor-sharp talons of bone instead of fingers, A long metal pole was jammed into its shoulders where its neck should have been, and strands of the disgustingly leathery skin wound around the pole and held it to the body. And, bolted to the pole, and looking almost comically out of place, were 2 siren speakers. I cautiously peeked over the edge of my cover, and that was when I saw what had distracted it. The siren head was taking slow, lumbering steps towards a figure sprawled on the floor, a figure with a leg drenched in blood, a figure that looked horribly familiar. A second later, I knew for certain that it was Gemma. Somehow, she had injured a leg and was unable to hide when the sirens first started sounding. As the creature stepped closer, bending down and raising its talons of bone, the sirens blared again. The same echoing, distorting sound, now 100 times louder as it echoed through the confined space of the mall. I was about to do something stupid out of desperation, but before I could leap up and over my cover, something changed in an instant. The long, drawn-out wail of the air raid-like siren instantly changed to the short, staccato bursts like those weather alerts we used to hear on TV. It was so loud I had to clamp on my ears as my head started pounding, but I still saw what happened. The siren head instantly straightened slightly, head brushing against the roof, and in an instant, it was running full tilt towards my right. I hadn't noticed it, but there was a man trying to hide behind an escalator, and the creature had spotted him. The sirens were blaring angrily in short bursts, and in the blink of an eye, the siren head had reached the man. He was screaming, although I could barely hear him over the ear-splitting noise, and then the creature's talons were thrust into his abdomen, and he was literally ripped in half by those bony fingers. The siren's back was to me, and the poor man's suffering was my opportunity. I leaped out from behind my kiosk and sprinted over to Gemma, sliding down beside her. Her eyes widened when she saw me, but we didn't have the luxury of speaking. I yanked her to her feet, and she grimaced, but knew enough to grit her teeth in pain instead of crying out. I turned then and started running back the way I came, hoping to round the corner before the creature finished with its fresh victim. But Gemma was slowing me down. She was limping beside me with her arm draped around my shoulder, but I knew we wouldn't make it. In sheer desperation, I paused and picked Gemma up bridal style, the adrenaline coursing through my veins, helping me ignore the 120-pound weight in my arms. I ran then as fast as I could, and I didn't look back. I could hear the siren calming now, changing back to the slow, drawn-out sound that signaled it wasn't agitated. When I heard it, we had long passed the bend in the hallway. It was a straight shot through the rest of the main hall and out of the mall, and we left the siren head's haunting cries echoing behind us. After we left the mall, I put Gemma down, and we limped our way back through the empty streets towards our house. We were out of most of the danger, but you could never be sure in the town. What you first thought was a lamppost in the distance could start running at you as it blared an inhuman screech, and the fog was already starting to roll in, obstructing our view. That made it all the worse. Gemma's condition was already starting to worsen before we made it back. When we arrived at our little log cabin on the corner of Cobb Street, her blonde hair was plastered to her head with sweat and her leg was still bleeding. I laid her down on the cot, locked the door, and moved to the medicine closet, all without a word. I was still panicking and my heart was still racing. "I'm sorry," she whispered from across the room, and when I turned to look at her, I saw those green eyes clouded with guilt. "It was my fault. I shouldn't have asked you to split up, and I—" "Gemma, it's okay," I said, pulling the gauze pads and antibiotic cream from the cupboard. "We all make mistakes, and you'll be okay. You can learn from this, alright? Now tell me, what happened?" Did you fall? Did it get your leg?" She shook her head as I crossed over and knelt down next to her, and she actually tried to sit up. I pushed her back down. "No, you don't understand, Ethan. I was shot. That guy, the other one in the mall, he surprised me and got me in the leg when I was looking at one of the stalls for food. And when I couldn't move, when I was trapped there, he tried to..." Gemma broke off, and for the first time since Dad died, she started crying. A horrible realization dawned on me, and I pulled her gently into a hug. She didn't have to spell it out. I knew what the people left around here were like. If the siren head had come across them while he was trying to assault my little sister, well, I certainly wasn't so guilty about letting him die to cover our escape. I wanted to do something for her, anything to help her with this, but I had no words to say. I didn't know what to do, so I figured I could help by focusing on what I could fix. "Let me see it," I finally said, and Gemma pulled back and peeled away her jeans with a wince. The wound looked bad, and I'm not an expert, but I think the bullet was still in there. I couldn't do anything about that, and the realization of our situation was suddenly starting to weigh down on me. Gemma had been shot, attacked, and had survived a head-on confrontation with one of the siren heads. We had seen early on what happened to those that survived listening to their cries point blank, and it wasn't pretty. I didn't say any of these thoughts out loud though. Thankfully, she drifted off in a few hours, and she never asked me what we both knew, so I didn't have to lie to her. So I disinfected her wound as best I could, cleaned it, and wrapped it in gauze. I lay down on the floor next to the cot, and after a few hours of tossing and turning, I also drifted off into a restless sleep. The first day after our encounter, she seemed fine. Her strength was returning a bit, and her spirits were higher, even if it seemed a bit forced. In fact, I almost had myself fooled that everything would be okay. But on the second morning, it started. She woke up by shooting up off her bed and screaming out, frantically whipping her head around the room. I rushed over to her and asked her what was wrong, and I saw the panic had returned in her eyes. "The sirens, Ethan! Can't you hear the sirens?" she gasped, barely able to get the words out. "They're so close! They're so close! They're so close!" That was day 2, and now it's even worse. She's barely coherent anymore. Most of her time is spent with nightmares for company instead of me, and when she is awake, all she can hear are the wails of sirens in her ears. Sirens that I can't hear, but that she insists are real. It's hard to watch, but I can't leave her. I refuse to. We're low on food, and while she's still sleeping in the morning, I decided to slip out and look for some. It's quiet today, though it's quiet almost every day, but the fog is mostly gone. I have an uneventful run back to the convenience store I had been a few days ago, and I managed to pick out a few cans of baked beans and a protein bar hidden away in a back room. I stuff them in my pack and hurry back home. I don't want to leave Gemma alone any longer than I have to. From the moment I open the front door, I know something is wrong. Her cot is empty, and her blood-soaked bandages lay crumpled on the sheets, like she had ripped them off. There's no sign of her in the shared living room, dining room, kitchen space where the cot is, and the only place she could be is in the bathroom. I call out for her, but she doesn't answer. Cautiously, I cross the room and peer into the little bathroom. I find her there, motionless, staring into the mirror. She doesn't look good. Her eyes look panicky, her hair is a mess, and she's standing in a little puddle of blood dripping from her leg, which looks raw and painful. I wonder if she's actually awake, and after swallowing down my fear, I call out again. "Gemma, are you okay?" Gemma turns towards me, slowly, agonizingly slowly. Her eyes show no recognition when she sees me, and her lips quiver. She opens her mouth, and I think she's about to speak, but instead, she lets out a sound that chills me to the bone. Gemma lets out a scream that is incoherent and filled with pain. A scream that is almost identical in tone and pitch as the sirens of the creatures that stalk the streets. It hits me now that it's too late for her, and I turn to race back into the main room. Gemma is faster though. Faster than she has any right to be, and she tackles me to the ground before I can even get halfway to the door. She doesn't stop screaming, the human siren wailing away as her fingernails tear into my arms and rake at my face. I try to tell myself that this isn't my sister anymore, that it's only a hollow shell that the siren heads have claimed for a feast. But it doesn't make it any less painful. Despite her actions or her mind, her body is still the same, and it's easy to toss her light body off. She stumbles back hard, slamming her head against the wood stove, and it gives me the few precious seconds I need. I scramble to my feet and lunge for Dad's rifle, grasping it and switching the safety off just as Gemma stands to her feet again. And then the siren-like screaming stops. Gemma stops. She stands there, head tilted back, and she opens her mouth again. I'm sure she's going to start screeching again. But this time, she speaks. "Ethan," she asks slowly, and for a moment, my heart leaps. But then I remember how the siren heads got Dad, how they mimicked the voices of their victims, speaking words and making sounds without any understanding of their meaning. And I know for sure that this isn't her. This isn't my Gemma. The word was spoken awkwardly, without understanding, without emotion. It's not her anymore. Her mind is gone. They took her, and if I let her go, this empty shell will seek them out and they'll feast on her body. As I realize that, I also realize that I'm crying. Gemma doesn't move for a minute, and for a moment, I'm left to sob alone in the silence with the rifle pointed between her eyes. Then, Gemma opens her mouth and screams again, the siren-like wail snapping me out of my thoughts, and she lunges at me, and I pull the trigger. I see the bullet rip through her skull, snapping her head back as bright blood sprays out onto me, the floor, the walls. Her limp body collapses in a little heap, blood leaking from her head and her leg both, and I can only stare in horror at what I've done. I drop the rifle and stumble backwards, feeling nausea rise up in my throat. My Gemma, my sister, is dead. I killed her. And in the days since, all I can see when I close my eyes is the form of her limp and broken body lying in that pool of her own blood. See, back when this first started, we thought it wouldn't last long. We thought the National Guard would come, or that the President would send the army, anything like that. But after the first week of the sirens wailing, no one came. Our phone lines went down, our cell reception disappeared, and though we still had internet and electricity, nothing seemed to get through to anyone. The population started to fall rapidly, and after the first 2 weeks of sirens and screams, we started to believe that we had been forsaken. I don't know what happened. I don't know where these creatures came from, or why we're here. Maybe the government never sent anyone. Maybe they came and couldn't break through the forest filled with the creatures. I don't know. But as the weeks turned to months, and the months turned to a year, and more of us died away to the sound of the sirens, we started to believe no one was coming. Then Dad died, leaving Gemma and I to fend for ourselves for another pitiful 3 months of desperate survival. And now I know it. I am alone. No one came for Gemma. No one will come for me. I don't know why we're in this living hell, but I'm trapped here. No one is coming for me. My father died to them. My sister died because of them. And it's only a matter of time before I'm gone too. I don't even think this will be sent out. It's like the rest of the world has been stuck in time, and we're the only ones that have moved on with the calendar. What is it now? 2015? 16? I don't even know. But I can hear the sirens now, Gemma. I don't see them, but I can hear them. I can hear them in the house, and in the streets, and in my ears, and in my mind, and in my dreams. I hear them now. I hear them now. My old roommate, Barney, was always very shifty. Over the 3 years I lived with him while attending graduate school together, he changed programs twice, had countless hobbies, friends, jobs and internships. It became evident Barney was evasive toward commitment, while being extremely susceptible to cutting corners and finding the easiest way possible to get something done. Barney always had a bad weight problem, which was ironic, given he actually switched to studying hospitality. Granted, he was extraordinarily lazy. Barney never shied away from a challenge he thought would put him in a good light, especially if it meant proving someone wrong. These particular instances were the only times I ever saw Barney truly motivated. However, it didn't stop him from finding the easiest way possible to complete his task. Barney accepted his greatest challenge at our usual diner we frequented after a night of drinking. Of course, Barney's order occupied a whole quarter of our table, and he showed no shame while joyously stuffing his face, like he was racing against the clock to finish his food. "You going to the electric chair after this?" our friend Dennis jokingly asked Barney. Our clique was tight enough where we could openly joke about each other in that manner. "You can barely fit in the booth. We're going to have to grease your fat ass up to get you out." Barney sneered in between mouthfuls of meatloaf, chicken tenders and cheesy bacon fries. "You know I always have to go out when I come here," Barney replied nonchalantly, taking a lengthy slug of his soda. "Especially after nights like this. Need something to absorb the booze so it doesn't come back out the way it went in, you know?" "I don't think that's how it works," I replied, causing everyone sitting at our booth to chuckle. If anything, overeating along with a night of excessive drinking is only exasperating what you're trying to prevent. "And you're studying dietetics now, aren't you?" asked our friend Lacey, who sat across from Barney. "Isn't it a little contradictory?" Barney paused mid-chew, fixating his stare on Lacey. "You being in the university's hospitality program is like a hunter owning a deer sanctuary, I think is what Lacey is saying," I added in a slow, awkward tone, which got nods of agreement from Dennis and Lacey. Barney swallowed his food and stared blankly. "You definitely don't practice what you preach," I added, "and I don't think you have the willpower to change that." Barney's eyes lit up. "You don't think I can drop this weight?" Barney asked slowly, his eyes narrowing at me. "We know you can't," I quickly replied. "You've always been one to try and disprove us when we've doubted you in the past, but you're almost 300 pounds, dude. Your mass is the one thing about you that's never changed since we've known each other." Barney wasn't insulted, but appeared intrigued by what I was alluding to with my remarks. "So, what's in it for me if I accept this task?" Barney asked inquisitively. "A longer, healthier life?" Lacey replied sarcastically. "Between the obesity, drinking, smoking, and whatever else you do, you're not making it past 40. We laid out the terms upon returning to our apartment. Barney weighed in at 289 pounds. He was given 100 days to lose 40 pounds, a task nobody thought Barney would take seriously, let alone accomplish. I did my part to help by disposing of all sugary or fattening foods and beverages, i.e. about half our cabinet and refrigerator. Barney admittedly struggled acclimating to his new diet and actually gained 2 pounds after the first 7 days. I thought the first week's discouraging results would be it for Barney, and was baffled when he stayed committed. The next Monday, when Barney picked me up from the police station, he claimed to have gotten a new, quote, special supplement, and bragged about how it would melt away the pounds. To clarify, I was in my university's forensic program and interned at the PD's toxicology division. My old colleague, Britt, you've never met her before, hooked me up with something. She wasn't really supposed to, and my insistence was relentless, but it's definitely what I need to start making progress, Barney enthusiastically gloated. What is it, like something they're still researching? I asked. Barney smirked. All I can say is it's completely organic, he replied confidently. Over the next 3 weeks, Barney slimmed down impressively fast without changing much of his diet or doing much, if any, exercise. When Barney weighed in at the 1 month mark, he already lost 29 pounds. Another 2 weeks passed and Barney lost 12 more pounds, which, when factoring the 2 pounds he initially gained, brought his net loss to 39 pounds. He reached his goal in just 6 weeks. I didn't know what Barney was taking, but the pounds practically started melting away, just like he said. Barney did experience some side effects, like dark bags under his eyes, vomiting, constant bathroom trips, and sharp, paralyzing abdominal pains. He constantly complained about feeling weak and tired. Sometimes he couldn't even get out of bed in the morning. I became concerned about his health and even tried convincing him to stop taking whatever he was on since he reached his goal. But Barney couldn't be swayed. I'll be better soon, don't worry, Barney weakly replied one day when he was bedridden. I tried prying further, but Barney gave me an attitude, which was where I drew my line. It was his life after all, so who was I to impose? Days later, Barney was completely rejuvenated and filled with an infinite supply of energy, despite continually losing weight at an alarming rate. Not only did Barney shed up to 60 pounds after 2 months, he even started attending our building's gym regularly, sometimes for hours on end. I hoped Barney would stop after hitting the 100-day mark, by which he lost as many pounds. He was completely unrecognizable if you hadn't seen him the last 3 months. Barney started putting on muscle and was in better shape than any of us. Although Barney's physique improved immensely, his persona altered drastically, and the side effects persisted. He still had all the energy in the world, but his abdominal pains, vomiting, and diarrhea worsened. He was also starting to exhibit erratic mood swings, acne breakouts, and insomnia bouts that sometimes kept him up for days. Despite his drastic weight loss, Barney also cleared our cabinets and refrigerators to satisfy his growingly unyielding appetite. My suspicions were confirmed while going through his bedroom one day when he was out, where I discovered vials and syringes containing a cloudy yellow substance. Between the nature of his side effects and remarkable physical transformation, it became abundantly clear Barney was using steroids. After 4 months, Barney was all muscle but started losing mass. He resembled an action figure with toned but narrow limbs and broad, bulky torso that his legs seemingly struggled to support. Whenever you talked to him, it was a dice roll whether he'd give you a normal response or explosive tirade. He pushed away a lot of his friends and even dropped out of grad school so he could solely focus on exercising when he wasn't eating everything in sight. My final straw was when Barney threw a chair at me after I ate my own takeout leftovers that he wanted for himself. I started staying at Dennis's place while searching for a new apartment. I only returned every 3 to 4 days to collect mail and incrementally pack my belongings. 2 weeks passed since I started distancing myself from Barney when I ran into his old colleague Britt, the one who gave him the steroids on the subway. I was naturally resentful for her role in Barney's alteration and didn't hold back when she asked how he was doing. "Just because you're both in dietetics doesn't mean you people know everything," I snapped. "That junk you gave Barney completely messed him up." Britt didn't say anything at first and gave me a bewildered stare. "What are you talking about?" she replied firmly, being clearly offended at my accusations. "I haven't seen Barney in months." "That's bull," I hissed back at her. "He distinctly said he got something from you just a few months ago to help him lose his weight. He specifically mentioned your name and said you, his colleague, gave him whatever he's... Barney and I haven't been colleagues since the fall." Britt barked at me. "He stopped by the lab a few months ago to say hi, but that was it. Barney changed focuses 5 months ago and we were only in the same program for 8 weeks. Britt didn't give me a chance to respond and stormed off the subway cart. Part of me still didn't believe her, whose reaction I initially perceived as defensive. Coincidentally, I was going to my apartment when we ran into each other. It had been about 10 days since my last visit, and I still had to return periodically for my mail until I found somewhere else to live. While walking to my apartment, I kept thinking about how vehement Britt was after I called her out for giving Barney those steroids. After replaying the situation in my head, perhaps I mistook a defensiveness for genuine exasperation from facing such a ferocious accusation. Some doubt creeped into my mind, wondering if it was possible I accused her of something she didn't do and just made a complete ass of myself. I dismissed the notion as I entered my building and headed straight towards the mailboxes, only to find mine was empty. Although we weren't really talking, Barney sometimes took my mail whenever he checked and put anything I received in my bedroom. Of course, this meant I now had to go into the apartment and risk running into him during one of his sporadic mood swings. Before entering the apartment, I pressed my ear against the door to listen for any sounds of movement. It didn't sound like he was home, but upon stepping inside, I heard a loud crunching that coincided with my footsteps. Looking down, I was stepping over shards of shattered pottery. As the door shut behind me, I surveyed my surroundings, seeing the apartment was a mess. The air contained a rancid aroma, like a combination of stale urine and that distinct odor you'd associate with a barnyard. Stacks of dirty dishes filled the sink and covered the entire kitchen counter. Piles of pizza boxes and takeout containers were clustered in the main room. Broken glass and porcelain littered the floor, and nearly every piece of furniture was overturned or out of place. Pulling my shirt collar over my nose, I reminded myself that I was only here to get my mail and leave. My bedroom door was slightly ajar, not completely closed like I left it the last time I visited, meaning Barney had since entered my room. Hoping all he did was drop off my mail, I was about to step inside when I heard a rustling noise, accompanied by a loud thump coming from Barney's room. His bedroom light was on, and a low grunting noise started emanating from inside. Knots formed in my stomach upon realizing Barney was indeed home, making me want to get out of there faster. I was about to quietly enter my bedroom when Barney made another, louder grunt that morphed into a groan. I stopped, feeling obligated to check if he was alright, since Barney sounded like he was in some degree of pain. Barney groaned again, this one much louder and sounded more agonizing as I crept towards his bedroom doorway, hesitating before calling out to my ex-roommate. "You alright, Barney?" I asked while slowly pushing Barney's door open and poking my head inside. The image I saw will forever be cemented in my memory. Barney's room was derelict. His bedroom air hung thick with that putrid odour, which was so strong I almost retched and underwent a brief spell of intense lightheadedness. Barney was unrecognisable. He lay on top of his mattress, which was covered in thick brown, greenish yellow and dark red stains. He was completely nude and underwent an appalling bodily dysmorphia. Barney's limbs were abnormally frail, like they'd been drained of all muscle, fat, and reduced to skin and bone. The same went for his face, which looked eerily skeletal. Barney's lips and skin around his eyes were blackish purple, contrasting fiercely from his sickly, greyish pale tone. Every ounce of mass Barney's body appeared to have lost looked like it collected in his profusely swollen abdomen that resembled a beach ball-sized boil on the verge of bursting. An elaborate web of black and dark blue veins covered the blotchy dark red surface of Barney's massively bloated abdomen, from which pus, blood, and other fluids oozed out of its small, slit-like opening. What was most unnerving, and why I didn't immediately bolt out of the apartment, were Barney's wide, agony and terror-filled eyes. He was still alive, still enduring whatever unspeakable excruciation this morbid deformed state imposed upon his body. Whenever his lips parted, it seemed Barney could only emit those harrowing grunts and groans. His face became more animate when I appeared, my stomach churning when Barney's limbs started nudging, making these squirmy, twitch-like movements that looked alien and unnatural. While I was absolutely repulsed, Barney was clearly signalling he wanted to tell me something. "Barney, what? I shakily gasped, struggling to form a sentence. "What did you do to yourself?" Barney was about to respond, but his face soured as he tightly shut his eyes and grit his teeth. His neck strained back, limbs stiffened as a gargling grunt slowly escaped his lips that escalated into a scratchy bellow of sheer agony. My eyes were drawn towards Barney's inflated abdomen, whose surface appeared to start bubbling and shifting, like something inside of it was moving. My attention returned to Barney, who started spewing pure gibberish in a weak, raspy voice. I couldn't understand a word he spoke, but his face's expression indicated Barney was talking through the crippling pain and desperately intent on relaying whatever he was trying to say. The only words I understood were his last two. "Inside me." Barney succumbed to the retching pain enshrouding him as he sharply bent his neck back again and released another groan that quickly escalated into a shrill, bellowing shriek. His limbs completely outstretched, I froze in place and watched in horror as Barney's abdomen began to split open. A popping, tearing noise filled the room, while pus, blood, and other coloured fluids spilled out from the widening cavity, followed by what I thought were his entrails, but was something else. Something alive. Slithering out of Barney's abdomen was a worm-like creature. It had a flat, narrow body that was greyish-white in colour, about as thick as a Sharpie marker, with light brown, stripe-like ridges running horizontally down its backside. Its bulb-shaped head was about the size of a golf ball, which, from a series of smaller tendrils, protruded and swayed lazily, seeming like they were waving at me. Barney's inflated abdomen swiftly shrunk as the creature, along with pus, blood, and other fluids, were discharged. I was mesmerised by its length, trying to estimate how many feet this thing measured. 5, 6, 7, 8? The creature slithered across the floor for a few seconds, looking like it was getting a grip on its bearings, before making an abrupt turn towards a nearby ventilation shaft. The creature morphed its body to fit through one of the cover's openings until it was out of sight. Barney was motionless, his outstretched stick-like limbs surrounded by the blood, pus and other fluids coating the mattress and pooling on the floor. His eyes remained widened and mouth hung open, like his thin, bony face was frozen mid-scream. As soon as I retained the ability to move, I swiftly pivoted and vomited profusely in the hallway before staggering out of the apartment and calling the police. I found out more details in the following weeks through some contacts at the police department. It turned out Barney did in fact get what was making him lose so much weight from Brit. However, it wasn't the steroids or something willingly given to him. I learned Brit is actually studying parasitology and, a few months ago, was conducting extensive research on tapeworms. Nobody knows exactly how, but Barney made an impromptu visit to Brit at a lab, during which he discreetly swiped a live sample. That explains why Barney lost so much weight without exercising or changing his eating habits, and why he consumed everything in sight during those final weeks. Nobody ever found out where he got the steroids from, but Barney probably thought they would offset his weight loss and fatigue brought on by the tapeworm's presence in his body. Although they improved his physique, the steroids, which were an unidentified homemade batch, caused unprecedented mutations on the tapeworm, like its monstrous growth. According to Barney's autopsy, all of his bodily organs were missing, making me believe the parasite consumed them before vacating his body. I don't know if anyone ever found the actual tapeworm I saw burst out of Barney's body. I imagine it didn't survive long afterwards, but the thought of that thing alive, searching for a new host, still keeps me up at night. I always wonder if I was ultimately responsible for Barney's death, since I challenged him to lose weight. Perhaps he was doomed either way, since his grossly unhealthy habits probably would have condemned him to a short life anyway. Like I said, Barney went to great lengths when challenged to disprove others, and the last thing he ever did, to the most extreme extent. As the needle on my fuel gauge hovered over empty, I dropped my fingers against the steering wheel, eyes searching the rain-soaked windscreen for any sign of a gas station. I'd foolishly overestimated that the amount I filled up with just yesterday would be enough to get me home from work. But now, I was just a few seconds from breaking down in the middle of the road. And, following that pattern of great wisdom, I stayed through that meeting at work, even though every cell in me was screaming to return to the comfort of home. Judging by the houses whose boarded up exteriors were scrawled over with crude graffiti and the few figures that hovered, half hidden in the shadowy corners of the streets, just out of peripheral vision, this was not the kind of place anyone wanted to break down in. Just then, a familiar bright, shell-shaped yellow and red neon logo smeared into my view, and my heart leapt in relief. As my eyes adjusted to the sudden glow, I saw that the filling stations there were occupied, just enough for me to fill up and leave as quickly as possible. As I disembarked from the car, the hairs on my forearms prickled upwards. I tried to dismiss it as the night chill, as my own breath ghosted up as a vaporous cloud. But the stiffness in my spine remained. It was the kind you only got when you knew you were being watched. A rapid series of pattering footsteps that rushed out from the surrounding shadows shattered the temporary calm, and I whirled around, my hand already clenched around my cell phone, ready to call 911 at any second. Instead of the glint of a pocket knife or any other threat that I'd imagined, there stood the friendliest looking golden retriever I'd ever seen. Its coat was a sandy golden colour that shone under the flickering lights. It stood there, pink tongue lolling out of his mouth and long tail swaying in the air. Its dark eyes sparkled up at me as if it had been waiting for me. It was enough to destabilize my body from the panic mode it had been plunged into. Before I knew it, I was half kneeling, my hand extended out towards it. The dog rushed into my touch, burying its head in the palm of my hand with a happy whine, as if it was the first time it had ever been touched with love in its life. As I scratched the space between its ears, I thought back to my own dog, Cooper. I had practically spent half my life with him. He had been my parents' dog when I was born. There were still baby photos of him curled around me as I tried to catch his tail. As I'd learned to walk, he'd bound along beside me, making sure I didn't fall over. He'd been my partner in crime. He'd raced with me on my bike through the neighborhood, stayed up with me long past when I should have been asleep watching horror movies, where he'd always bark at the screen and just be there to lap up my tears whenever I'd had a bad day. One day, I'd come down to breakfast to wake him up for another adventure, only to find him lying cold in his dog basket. We buried him that day under the old willow tree, where he used to sleep in the shade of on warm summer days. I'd never cried so hard in my life. He had been 12 years old when he died. Everyone agreed he'd lived a good, long life, but the pain of losing him had never faded. The dog before me could have been his twin, and the long, closed wound within me threatened to reopen. As my fingers combed through the thick mane of its neck, I noticed an absence of any collar. A stray? But this dog looked like it had walked off the set of a pedigree commercial. It was the kind that would have won a blue ribbon in any dog show in the country. The thought of someone leaving such a beautiful animal to fend for itself in a hellhole like this incensed me. A distant gunshot, which was followed by what sounded like a woman's wail, made us both jolt. I reluctantly pulled away from the dog, who looked up at me with a confused whine that only made me feel even more of a monster. "I'm sorry, buddy," I murmured, rising to my feet, "but I can't be here any longer, as much as I'd like to." As I began to walk away, it started following me. My heart clenched further in my chest. I couldn't resist the temptation to tussle its head one more time, even when I knew I was probably instilling it with false hope that I would come back. Even when I walked through the automatic sliding door, I saw that shimmering golden shape sitting by the pumps, just waiting for me to return. As expected, on a night like this, the store was almost completely empty, barring the dour-faced employee behind the plexiglass shielded counter and the chalk-faced tweaker lurching over by the magazines. His face was pocketed with angry red marks, with the skin pulled so tightly across the bones that his skull was almost completely visible, who scowled out at me from underneath his oversized hoodie. I slid the money through the opening. I still couldn't shake that dark, wet nose from my mind, one that I knew was just outside, that I would leave still waiting there, probably for the rest of its life. I knew I had to leave, but I couldn't. As I stepped back out into the frigid evening, it ran to my side with an excited, ringing bark, licking my hand. I couldn't help but smile, despite the pain that stabbed at me inside. It seated itself patiently by my side as I started to fill up my tank, without even being told. "I'm so sorry," I thought, as I cast down brief glances at him. There was nothing more I wanted than to bundle that dog in my car and take him home with me. But there was still the lingering fear that he might belong to someone else, that his collar could have fallen off. Maybe he belonged to a little child, the same way Cooper had once been mine. I couldn't stand the thought of inflicting that kind of pain on anyone else. Just as I'd opened my door, I was about to seat myself inside. A low, metallic click startled me from my thoughts. I turned up and saw the same junkie from the store with a silver 9mm handgun squeezed in his trembling, needle-marked hand. The breath was sucked out of my throat. "Give me your money, man," he barked, frothy saliva flying from brownish, rotted teeth. I raised up my palms, trying to appear nonchalant, even when my heart was seconds away from bursting. It was every nightmare scenario I'd ever had about this place embodied in physical form. "Hey, look, I don't want any trouble," I began. "I just want to get home. Give me all your money." He jabbed the barrel of the gun out towards me, forcing me to step out of the illuminated space of the gas station into the blanketing darkness, far out of sight from the blinkering security cameras, where he could probably kill me and get away with it. Just as my eyes closed, readying myself for the searing pain of a bullet ripping through my intestines, a bark rang out. The junkie whipped around, gun still in hand, and to my horror, I saw the dog facing him, pearly white fangs bared. His face fixed into a snarl as he pointed the gun directly at its temple. I rushed forward to tackle him, my own safety forgotten. "No!" But before he could fire, the dog's head snapped back as if its neck had been broken by an invisible force, growls becoming deeper until they sounded like nothing that had ever walked this planet before. Its small body writhed, skin rippling like it was being inflated with air. Both my would-be assailant and I stared, too terrified yet mesmerized to tear our eyes away from the sight. Its jaws unhinged open like a boa constrictor's, stretching wider and wider until the skin around its mouth looked ready to tear. We watched as a fleshy, red, throbbing pillar of flesh began to merge out from the dog's exposed esophagus, lined with webbing. It seemed to expand before our very eyes until it was bigger than the body of the creature it emerged from. I'd have to estimate it to be at least 6 feet in length. Then the mass reshaped itself from almost gelatinous to a serrated spear and buried itself in the right eye of the gunman, the sharpened tip cracking through the back of his skull. The gun clattered from his hand as his limp body collapsed onto it, still held half upright by the solid mass. Just as quickly as it had emerged, it retreated into the dog's throat, who swallowed it down and got back onto all 4 paws like nothing ever happened, though its sandy coat was smeared with red arterial spray. I crawled away backwards from it as it padded over towards me with the same delighted expression, oblivious to my terror. I waited in cold anticipation for it to do the same to me. But it didn't. Instead, it draped itself across my lap, snuggling its head into my stomach. My body relaxed as I realized that whatever it was, it didn't seem to want to hurt me. It had just saved my life. The body of the junkie lay just a few feet away, a bubbling red welt oozing out over the shattered remains of his orbital socket. I looked back down at those dark eyes that stared up at me like I was the most amazing thing in the universe. It was then I knew. I must be insane, I thought to myself. It sat in the front seat next to me, head hanging out of the half-open window. A chalky string of saliva hung from its open jaws, having the time of its life. It howled along to the country music, droning out from the station that I'd randomly switched it to. To any outside watchers, we were just a man and his dog out on the road. Except we weren't. I still had no idea what I had invited into my life, what walked around in the form of a dog, whose shiny coat was still dotted with spray droplets of blood, even after being soaked and dried off. But somehow, I felt like I wasn't going to regret it. I expected most of my neighbours to have been in bed by the time my car rolled into the garage, but much to my surprise, I saw my elderly neighbour, Mrs. Kim, shuffle up on her porch, struggling with the bags of delivered groceries. She was a plump, jovial woman in her mid-60s who entertained me with stories about her grandchildren, 2 of whom were in medical school now. She peered at me over the fence. "You're home late," she remarked. "Long day?" I let out a dry laugh as I massaged the back of my neck. "You have no idea." Her face suddenly lit up, letting out a high-pitched squeal as she clapped her hands, her fallen grocery bags forgotten. The dog jumped over the gate and started licking her as she cooed. A brief panic flared within me, only to simmer when I didn't see any signs of hostility. "Oh, he's adorable! Where did you find him?" she exclaimed. I swallowed. "At the animal shelter. It was getting kind of lonely around here." "What's his name?" she asked. Cooper," I blurted out. I said it without thinking, eager to get inside and avoid any suspicions. But the more I looked over to it, the more the name seemed to fit. After dragging him away from the delighted Mrs. Kim and bidding a hurried good night, we'd retired indoors, where I finally allowed myself to breathe. His paws clacked against the wooden floors as he raced from place to place, sniffing out each individual object as he mapped out every inch of his new home. It was a sound that I never thought I would hear again in my life. It returned to my side, nestling its soft skull into the palm of my waiting hand. I didn't care about whatever it was anymore. I just wanted it to be near. "Good dog," I murmured. "Good dog." Why would you tell a 5-year-old such a messed up tale? Ever since the memory of my 5th birthday came back to me, this is the question I've kept asking myself. But I don't have the answer. I suppose I shouldn't be that surprised, given the other stories Grandma told me when I was little. The one about Mr. Longfingers, for instance, and the secret of the special knock. I really shouldn't be surprised at all. What follows is a memory from the day I turned 5. I must have been repressing that day for years, because it's taken weeks of therapy for me to unlock it. "Grandma, will you tell me a story before bed?" She was halfway to the bedroom door when my words stopped her. I didn't want her to go. Grandma had just tucked me in and turned off my bedside lamp, and I suddenly felt afraid. Partly, it was the darkness of my bedroom. The shadows were so thick I could barely make out my stuffed toys sitting in a row on top of my dresser, but mainly it was my new birthday present. The present Grandma had got me. It wasn't my main present. That was the pack of monsters in my pocket toys I'd ripped open downstairs. No, this was an extra present. A secret present. I hated it. Even in the dark, I could see its shadowy outline on my bedside table. The thing gave me the creeps. A story? Well, what kind of story would you like to hear? It was a silly question, because Grandma only ever told one kind of story, the scary kind. But because I was already a bit freaked out, I said something I wouldn't normally have done. "Nothing too scary, Grandma." Grandma raised her eyebrows at me. "Not too scary?" I shook my head. She leaned over and switched my bedside light back on, then perched at the foot of my bed, smiled down at me. Out of the corner of my eye, I could still see Grandma's present. He was watching me from my bedside table. I did my best to ignore it. "Okay," said Grandma, making herself comfortable. "I think I'll tell you a story about a witch." "Once upon a time," Grandma began, "there was a young woman who lived at a cottage by the sea. She didn't have a care in the world. She went to school and she painted and she read adventure books by the fire in the evening. This girl lived with her mother and her grandmother, and they were all very close. She loved her family very much. One day in the early summer, the girl was coming home from school when she met a boy on the path. She'd never spoken to him before, but she recognized him well enough. He wore the same uniform she did after all, and she guessed he must be in the year above her at school. "Where are you off to?" said the boy. His shirt was untucked and he was smoking a cigarette. The girl hesitated. Her mother had told her cigarettes were bad. She'd also told her to never speak to strangers on her way home from school. But then again, thought the girl, was this boy actually a stranger? The headmaster at the school said they were all one big family. If this boy wore the same uniform as her, they couldn't really be strangers, could they? "I'm going home," answered the girl. "My house is along this path." The boy finished his cigarette, then flicked it into the grass. He smiled at the girl. "Before you go home, don't you want to see something cool?" he asked. The girl was curious, but she also knew she couldn't be late. Her mother would worry terribly if she was late, so she thanked the boy and told him she had to be on her way. But just as she walked past him, he called out to her again. "It's a puppy," said the boy. "Our dog had a litter of puppies last week, and Dad said I could keep one. It's in this old barn near my house. Don't you want to see the puppy?" Now, the girl loved puppies. She wanted a dog for as long as she could remember, but her mother always said they couldn't afford one. Right then, she'd have given anything in the world to pet a cute little puppy. When she closed her eyes, she could picture it. A happy little dog with a big pink tongue and a wagging tail, eager to meet her. The girl paused and looked down the path that led back to her house. She thought about her mother. Then she looked back at the boy, who was smiling at her. Was there really any harm, thought the girl, in taking a quick look? So the girl followed the boy, and he led her over a stile and across a big field, and they kept going and going until the girl saw a large barn towering in the distance. And she was so excited that she walked as fast as she could, and the boy laughed and walked right along with her. The girl only started to feel nervous when they were right outside the barn. It had taken longer to get there than she thought it would, and the sun was a lot lower in the sky now. She was going to be late getting home. Her mother would be worried. She wanted to see the puppy quickly so she could hurry back, but the barn was dark and full of shadows, and she couldn't see any sign of it inside. "It's just over here, at the back," whispered the boy, as he took her hand and led her into the shadows. "He's going to be so excited to see you." So the girl took his hand and followed him, and even though his palm was sweaty, she held onto it tight, because she was suddenly starting to feel afraid. It was only when she heard footsteps and laughter behind her, and turned to see two bigger boys emerging from the barn's shadows, that the fear inside her turned to terror. When the girl finally got back home, the sun was setting over the ocean, and the sea was the colour of blood. The girl made it through the door of the little cottage before she collapsed in a heap in the hallway, crying her eyes out. It was her grandmother who found her like that. Now, the girl's grandmother was very old and very wise. Mother used to tell her that Grandma had lived so long and had seen so much that she knew all the world's secrets. When she was little, the girl had been frightened of her grandmother. But now, the old lady took the young woman in her arms, and she comforted her, told the girl her mother was working late and she wouldn't be home for a while, told the girl she could tell her anything she wanted, and in the hallway of their little cottage, the girl did. She told her grandmother about the boy and the barn and the horrible things done in the shadows, and her grandmother listened, and she grew very silent and very still. "Come with me," she said. The girl had hardly ever been in her grandmother's room before. When she was little, it always gave her the creeps. Her grandmother had a lot of old, scary paintings on the walls and strange little statues and carvings on her shelves. But right then, as her grandmother led her to an old wooden chair and sat her down, the girl hardly even noticed them. Her grandmother was speaking to her in a soothing voice, and all she could do was listen. She listened as her grandmother told her that there was a special trick she knew, a trick to protect against evil, a trick to protect her against those horrible boys, so that they'd never be able to hurt her again, so that she'd have control of them. As grandmother spoke, she fetched an old wooden box from the bottom of a wardrobe and unlocked it. Inside the box were countless knitted dolls. All of the dolls were the same blank cream colour, with no facial features at all, save for the eyes. Every single doll had a pair of eyes that seemed to follow the girl. As the grandmother pulled 3 dolls out of the box, she closed her own eyes, began to whisper. The sound made the girl's skin itch, but it didn't last long. Soon, her grandmother had lined the dolls up on the carpet, and her eyes were open again. The last thing she pulled from the box were a pair of black knitting needles and some yarn. "Those boys that hurt you, sweetheart," she whispered. "I want you to describe them to me." And although she was still terrified, and although it made her feel sick, the girl did. She described the boys as well as she could remember. She described them as a grandmother went to work with her needles. And finally, with the blood-red sun disappearing below the sea outside the cottage window, the dolls were finished. The girl's grandmother took the girl by the hands and looked into her eyes. "I want you to keep hold of these dolls, sweetheart," she whispered. "As long as you have possession of them, those boys will never be able to hurt you again." And do you know what? Those boys never did. The girl was sitting in an armchair overlooking the sea when her grandmother burst through the door of the cottage. It was 2 days after they'd made the dolls, and for the first time since she'd met the boy in the pathway, the girl was feeling calm again. She was feeling calm, but her grandmother clearly wasn't. As the girl turned from the window and smiled in greeting, the old woman held a newspaper out to a girl with shaking hands. 3 brothers tortured and killed in a brutal mass slaying, read the headline. "Agatha," whispered her grandmother. "Oh, Agatha, what did you do?" But the girl just kept smiling. She kept smiling as she took her grandmother by the hand and led her upstairs to her bedroom. She kept smiling as she opened a little cupboard and pulled out a cardboard box. And when the old lady cried out in shock and horror as she saw the 3 dolls inside, the girl kept smiling still. "What did you do, Agatha?" whispered her grandmother again. But it was pretty obvious what the girl had done. Each of the dolls had been impaled with at least 12 sewing pins, all of which had been pushed through their knitted heads. The area below each of their waists had been turned black with a flame. The girl smiled down at her work and took the grandmother's shaking hands in her own. "They won't be hurting anyone now, will they?" she whispered. "You see, sweetheart," said grandmother as she stood up from my bed and switched off the light. "I gave you one with a happy ending." I lay in the dark feeling sick. I don't think I'd understood everything Grandma had told me, not right then at least, but I'd understood enough. I'd understood enough to know I felt worse now than I had before the story started. "Grandma, wait," I said, my voice stopping her mid-turn. "Isn't your name Agatha?" Grandma looked back at me and smiled. She walked over and leaned down, kissing me on my forehead. "It's time to get some sleep, Christopher," she whispered. "And remember, that present I got you is always there if you ever need it." She stood up and left my bedroom. I stared after her. But a few moments later, my eyes were pulled back to the gift on my bedside table. The knitted doll. It gazed right back at me, its face featureless, save for 2 blank, staring eyes. If you write about the London music scene long enough, you'll eventually hear about the cursed karaoke song. At this stage, it's become part urban legend, part industry in-joke. The story goes that one of the city's first karaoke bars opened in Soho in the late 80s. Some people say it was used by a criminal gang to launder money. Others say it was a front for a demon-worshipping cult. I even heard one version where the owner had installed a haunted karaoke system from Japan. Less creative types say it was just dodgy wiring. The outcome is always the same though. The bar burned down to the ground in 1989, killing anyone unlucky enough to be there that night. The victims of the blaze were somehow marked by a curse and can never move on to the afterlife. So the souls are doomed to drift from bar to bar, waiting for some unlucky punter to sing the last song played before everything went up in smoke. Strange things allegedly happen to the person afterwards. It starts off small, not sleeping, hearing strange noises, your typical horror movie staples. It gets progressively worse until the poor side is so tormented that they take their own life. The thing is, people can never agree on which song is supposedly cursed, but someone always knows somebody who sang it, regardless of how tenuous the link is. The hapless singer is usually an ex-colleague's uncle or second cousin of a roommate from uni. I suppose that's what makes it such a good story. Ludicrous, but hard to completely debunk. I'd learned about the curse when I was writing for Noteworthy. The magazine had never made big waves, but it's always had a solid fan base since its founder, Jez Musgrove, was a legend in the indie circuit during the 90s. By the time he contacted me, I was quite happy to leave blogging behind to share my thoughts on Noteworthy's splashy website. The fact that I actually spent most of my days funneling marketing content and composing moronic tweets is slightly less thrilling. It was mid-December last year, and some bright spark insisted we do a pub crawl for our Christmas party. The night consisted of downing overpriced drinks in overpacked establishments before being buffeted along to the next location, finally ending up in some grungy after-hours pub. Now, get a group of drunk music writers together and there's a good chance they'll talk about the cursed karaoke song. What normally follows is an exchange of wild theories leading to a heated discussion that ends with the drunkest person belting out a heartfelt rendition of a song they summarized as evil. That night was no different. There's a woman who works for Noteworthy by the name of Julie Connell, an old-timer from the glory days of print media. She is known for being spiky around the younger staff members, but I've always found her okay. It took me a while to see that she was reacting strangely to the conversation. Whereas everyone else either joked or chimed in with their own opinions, she became very still and visibly tense. No one else seemed to notice. I kept watching as she sat there, staring at a gin and tonic while Alistair Murray put forward an impassionate yet unconvincing case for Lady in Red. That was when she left to go outside, muttering something about needing a cigarette. I should have left her alone. Things would probably be different if I had. I shivered as I left the warmth of the pub, the cold biting through my thin winter coat. I'm not a regular smoker, so I asked Julie if I could bum a cigarette. She held out the packet and we stood there a while, smoking in silence. I watched as the wisps from my lit cigarette unfurled and dissipated in the darkness like little wraiths released onto the unsuspecting world. I'll admit, I'd had a few drinks on board by that stage, so I decided to ask her. So, what do you think? She looked puzzled, and I leaned in closer. The cursed song. Any theories? I waited for Julie to say something, but instead, she stared ahead, taking a pull on a cigarette. I watched as she seemed to debate what to do next. Eventually she sighed and nodded her head. It was 11 years ago, but Alice had been having problems before that. Julie's younger sister had always been fragile, but she hadn't experienced any big setbacks since her early 20s. However, the unlucky trifecta of a redundancy, breakup, and mounting debt seemed to have gradually eroded her mental state. According to Julie, their upbringing had been grim, full of bad memories and a never-ending rotation of foster families. Even as adults, she'd always felt responsible for Alice, which was how she'd ended up as a permanent fixture on Julie's couch. They'd gone out the night it happened. Julie had dragged her sister to see an up-and-coming band at a pub in Croydon. It had been Alice's first night out in months, and she seemed to be enjoying herself. The band were fine, but not particularly memorable. As the audience began to disperse, a gaunt-looking man took to the stage to set up assorted pieces of equipment. He was very tall and wore an ill-fitting grey suit. A thin shriek echoed from the mic when he introduced himself as the MC and welcomed the now sparse crowd to karaoke night. Julie hadn't recalled seeing any posters or flyers for karaoke, but figured it may have been a semi-regular thing. As the MC scanned the crowd for volunteers, she felt a rush of air to her left as Alice's hand shot up. Alice had always been a good singer and could never resist the lure of a microphone. She downed a drink before trotting towards the MC. Julie noticed the cuffs of his white shirt were rimmed with black as he held out his hand and pulled Alice onto the stage. As Alice took the mic, Julie felt her focus begin to slip, like everything was blurred at the edges. It was July and the pub's AC was practically non-existent, so she decided to nip out for some air and a quick smoke. She briefly heard the opening bars to a familiar song as she stepped outside. Julie lit another cigarette, taking a long drag before exhaling slowly. I waited, not wanting to interrupt, as she appeared to be concentrating very hard. In the end, she just shook her head and continued. The stage was empty when Julie went back inside. As she cast a searching glance for Alice, she overheard a girl with henna-dyed hair tell a friend that there was a woman in the toilets who was in, quote, a right state. Julie found Alice sobbing hysterically in a pea-soaked cubicle. She was obviously terrified, but Julie couldn't make any sense of her incoherent babbling. She eventually managed to bundle Alice into a taxi before getting her home. Julie reckoned she'd had some sort of episode that she'd snap out of in a few days. But Alice got worse. A lot worse. In the weeks that followed, she became plagued by nightmares, and Julie often awoke to late-night fits or ear-splitting screams. Her hygiene began to suffer too. At first, it was subtle, like wearing the same thing for a few days or showering every other day. But as time wore on, Alice refused to bathe or change her clothes. Her hair became lank and greasy, and clusters of whiteheads sprouted around her nose and chin. Julie arranged appointments with doctors and therapists, but Alice refused to go, preferring to spend her days on the couch, staring listlessly at the endless sludge of bad daytime TV. And things had gone on like this, until the incident with the mirrors. Julie had come home from work to find Alice in the bathroom, tunelessly humming to herself as she coated the mirror in chalkboard paint that Julie had bought for a long-abandoned DIY project. Alice had done the same thing to the mirror in the bedroom, her progress charted by the black paint on the tiles and carpet. She'd even blotted out the mirrors on Julie's compacts and eyeshadow palettes. When she confronted her sister, Alice gave an elated smile and triumphantly proclaimed that they were now gone. Julie lay awake that night, listening to Alice frantically pacing up and down the flat and whispering to herself. She barely slept at all now. As much as she loved Alice, Julie had begun to feel a gnawing pang of dread and even resentment towards her sister. The situation was out of her control. The next morning, she dialed a number she never wanted to dial and had a conversation she never wanted to have. After hanging up, Julie called in sick to work. She wanted to be there when they came for Alice. Alice was still asleep when Julie flicked on the kettle. Realizing she had no milk, she threw her coat over her pajamas and went to the corner shop. She'd been gone 10, maybe 15 minutes. She recalled the keys jingling as she turned them in the lock and pushed open the front door, which opened onto the living room. This was followed by a dull, wet thud as she dropped the carton of milk. Shards of glass and bits of plastic littered the parquet floor. Julie's TV and stereo was smashed beyond repair. She tore through the flat, calling out for her sister, but Alice was nowhere to be found. Julie grabbed her phone and made a frantic call to the police. It didn't take long to find Alice. What was left of her, anyway? According to the CCTV footage, she had exited the flat shortly after Julie, turning left where her sister took a right moments before, and walked to the tube station on Clapham High Street, where she waited calmly on the platform before hurling herself in front of an oncoming train. Julie threw down a cigarette butt, stubbing it out with a steel-toe-capped boot, and shivered. The coroner's inquest declared that Alice's suicide had been caused by a dissociative episode triggered by stress. Considering her medical history, it wasn't a massive stretch for them to reach that conclusion. I told her I was sorry I asked. She shrugged and said she'd learn to live with it. Like everyone else, Julie used to joke about the curse. Now, she just made a point of leaving the room when the conversation turned towards karaoke. By then, Julie looked like she was on the verge of tears, but I couldn't leave it alone. I asked her what song Alice sang that night. She actually laughed at this. Alice had sung "Can't Stand Losing You." The irony clearly wasn't lost on her. I thanked Julie for the cigarette and went back inside, now very sober by our conversation. We didn't talk again for the rest of the night and eventually headed our separate ways. I should have let it go after that, and I never bothered Julie about it again. There just seemed to be more to the story, like an itch I needed to scratch. Further research led me to some old tabloid clippings about the fire in Soho, a few forum posts, and an old Angel Fire site on urban myths. The site included a link to a Japanese article about an incident at a bar in Kabukicho in 1973. Since I don't speak Japanese and machine translation proved less than illuminating, I threw my findings together in a short article that Jez approved and posted to the site. It got decent traction, but nothing groundbreaking. Figuring I'd wasted enough time, I was ready to move on after that. Then an envelope arrived on my desk. There was no stamp or postmark, and it arrived with the rest of the Morning Post. It contained a flyer for a karaoke night at a pub in Kilburn. I wouldn't have paid any mind to it until I read the handwritten note scrawled at the bottom. Follow Alice down the rabbit hole. No need for the police. I had never mentioned Alice or her story in my article. I decided not to tell Julie about the flyer. She made a point of avoiding me since that night in the pub. Any communication we had now was through tersely worded emails. Besides, the words Julie Connell and Practical Joker don't exactly mesh. I did show the flyer to Jez, who grumbled that I'd better things to do than traipse around boozers in Kilburn on a Tuesday night. It may say something about my personal life, but I really didn't have anything better to do. So, that was exactly what I did. It was already getting dark when I exited the underground. It had begun to drizzle, and a chilly mist closed around me like a fist as I began to make my way up Kilburn High Road. It didn't take long to find the place. The bar sat in an alley off the main thoroughfare. The dingy sign above read, "The Borough Inn." I was greeted by ambient, lo-fi music that hummed through the narrow front bar. I bought a drink and spotted the staircase leading to the basement, illuminated by a dim orange glow from the overhead lights. The music transitioned to acid house as I descended the steps. This area was larger, complete with a stage and dance floor flanked by red lacquered tables. I placed my drink on a vacant table and scanned the room. There were 9 people in total. Most of them looked like the remnants of after-work drinks or regulars with nowhere else to be. The atmosphere was more Soundgarden than Savage Garden. I sipped my soda and lime, momentarily lost in my thoughts. So lost, in fact, that I didn't notice when the man in the grey suit appeared on the stage. He was crouched forward, checking some unseen piece of equipment behind him. He then stood to his feet and turned. He was very tall and pale, with dark hair greased into a pompadour. His suit was made from a sateen-like fabric, with wide, boxy shoulders that swamped his narrow frame. There was something oddly brittle about him, like something that had been melted down and recast over and over until all that remained was a pale imitation of a man. The hairs on the back of my neck rose as he introduced himself to the small crowd as the MC. Contrary to what you may think, I had not planned to go near that stage. First of all, any singing that I do takes place in the confines of my shower, and secondly, as a journalist, my job was only to observe. But something drew me towards that stage and the outstretched hand of that MC. I noticed his fingernails were long and yellow as he pulled me onto the platform. Nobody else paid us any attention. At the time, I thought it was just a big city indifference. Now, I'm not sure if something else was at play. I cast about, trying to locate the screen where I could select my song. The MC shook his head and let out a high-pitched giggle. I was taken aback at how shrill it was. He flashed a vulpine smile and pointed to a small white box with various knobs and dials. Big black letters on the front read Duke 8. It looked old. At the base of the box was a thick slot for an 8-track player. To the right of the slot was a small hollow. I shot the MC a look of confusion. He contorted his features in feigned exasperation before handing me a strange coin. There was an image of a mountain on one side and the number 100 etched onto the reverse. He nodded towards the white box. Sure enough, there was a thin slit at the top. I followed the MC's lead and popped the coin in the slot. The machine whirred to life and the lights at the bottom flashed red. A loud ka-thunk sounded and a heavy 8-track cassette dropped into the vacant aperture. The MC picked up the cartridge and inserted it into the player before thrusting the microphone into my hand. He then twirled a delicate wrist in a circular motion, indicating that I should turn and face the audience. I was about to ask how I was supposed to read the lyrics. I shouldn't have worried. My breath caught in my throat as soon as I heard the song. A song I knew by heart, but desperately wanted to forget. I held the microphone to my lips as the music resonated from every corner of the room. Far too high definition for the 8-track's looping stereo. My tongue suddenly felt too big for my mouth. I closed my eyes, the familiar notes dredging up a pain that I kept submerged for years. I hit my cue and started to sing. I thought of my mother. She'd fallen into a coma at the end of her illness. I suppose it was a small mercy that she was allowed to spend her last remaining weeks at home. The only thing that remained intact was her hearing. That wasn't much comfort to a surely 13-year-old. I'd say things in a desperate attempt to shock her awake, like Dad was getting me a Vespa for Christmas, or that I dropped out of school to campaign for UKIP. I would have given anything for some kind of reaction, just to know she was still there. One morning, a parcel arrived. It was a CD mix of Mum's favourite songs that my uncle had put together. I slapped the CD on, and I recognised the first song immediately. In Your Eyes by Peter Gabriel. The first film her and Dad ever saw together was Say Anything, and the soundtrack had blared from a Ford Fiesta every day when she picked me up from school. The emotion was too much for Dad. He got choked up and had to leave the room for fear of bursting into tears. That was a pity, because he missed the most extraordinary thing. Mum started to move her head to the music. They were just small, fragile nods, but there was a rhythm to them. To me, it was everything. It meant that she was still connected to this world, that she could hear us, and she knew she wasn't alone. My mother died 2 days later. I think that's what ignited my passion for music, knowing the power that a few chords can have to pull you together or completely rip you apart. My eyes stung with tears as I opened them again. I wish I hadn't. The bar had vanished, along with the people. In their place was a room bathed in hues of blue and violet neon. The dance floor and PVC tables were replaced with dark wooden tables and soft leather stools, each topped with a small lamp and tasseled pink lampshade. A soft flurry fell from above. Was it snowing inside? I expected the snowflakes that landed on my hand to be cold. Instead, it was warm and the colour of soot. I craned my neck upwards and my mouth hung open in disbelief. There was no ceiling. All that remained was a jagged moor of blackened roof beams that opened onto a starless night sky. My attention turned back to the interior as a hideous smell permeated my nostrils, a discordant mix of damp earth and the meaty aroma of grilled bacon. I saw them then. Dozens of people faced the stage. Most of them were naked, with burnt and peeling skin that revealed patches of white bone. Some still had tufts of sizzled hair in places. Only the ghostly spectators at the front wore clothes. One man stood in a pair of pajamas, his neck ringed with purple ligature marks. One girl swayed to the music. The right side of her face was a tattered ruin. Another wore a wet velour tracksuit, her pale, bloated face lined with purplish veins. All had milky, irisless eyes that were fixed on me. I heard a small cough. The MC was casually leaning against the adjacent wall, looking on with a frank disinterest. His quiff was flecked with ash that had begun to accumulate on the wide shoulders of his suit. He made a circular, wrap-it-up motion with a gnarled index finger. I realised I'd stopped singing. Wanting to be free of this nightmare, I uttered the next lyric. Love, I don't like to see so much pain, so much wasted, and this moment keeps slipping away. My voice cracked at the bridge, and all my instincts, they return, and the grand facade so soon will burn. Members of the macabre audience contorted their bodies in awkward, jerky motions as they began to dance. I shut my eyes. In your eyes, I see the light, the heat. Some let out rasping moans and howls of approval. My voice became a whisper. Oh, I want that to be complete. The dreadful shrieks grew louder. The resolution of all the fruitless searches. The feverish cacophony continued until it reached an ear-splitting decibel. I couldn't take it anymore. I closed my eyes and screamed at the top of my lungs. Stop! Please stop! The next thing I felt was a hammy hand on my shoulder. You alright, mate? I opened my eyes to see the confused face of the barman staring back at me. I was alone on the stage. The MC and his flock of lost souls were nowhere to be seen. I wish I could say that there was an end of my experience, that I could chalk all of this up to an overwrought mind. But ever since that night, I've been experiencing some very strange things. They were small at first, like the sensation of fingertips grazing my skin, or the constant hiss of static when I turn on the TV or radio. Lately, it's become more pronounced. Like the last time I took a shower. I've tried to convince myself that I slipped, but I can't explain the blinding pain that made me topple onto the tiles, like something had connected sharply with my temple, like the knuckles of a closed fist. I haven't showered in a few days, and I'm avoiding changing my clothes. I can feel those invisible hands on me if I stay covered up. Today, I caught my reflection in the blank TV screen. The ragged outline of a man stood behind me, its pale eyes boring into mine. I live alone, and I can't go outside now. I'm sending you a warning while I can. If things ever go back to normal, please be careful when singing karaoke in London. The songs are just a conduit. It's the singers that are cursed. There are those things in life that stick with you. Questions that keep you up late into the night, troubling you to your core. Unanswered mysteries that haunt you like a stubborn ghost, always in the back of your mind. An angry spectre unwilling to die. The disappearance of my best friend, Eva Hoskins, and the unexplainable circumstances of our final few calls have served as my ghost. It's something I've dwelled on for years, asking myself questions I knew I could never answer, trying to make sense of that final day, those final calls. Well, like everyone else right now, I found myself alone at home with nothing but free time, and with free time comes the ghosts. I've had enough of tormenting myself, trying to make sense of something that I believe most likely defies any conventional explanations. Evan and I spoke on the day he disappeared. I was actually the last person he ever spoke to, as far as anyone knows. The knowledge was always accompanied by a significant weight, made only worse by the things he said. Strange, confusing things that I've yet to make sense of even now. Maybe you will have better luck. Perhaps you can explain what happened to Evan. Are you seeing this damn snow, dude? Evan's voice called from my phone in place of a greeting. I chuckled at a very abrupt, very Evan greeting. Wincing and lowering the volume on my phone appropriately in preparation for a conversation with my lively friend. At the time, I didn't notice it. And maybe even now I'm misremembering, creating details my mind assumed should have been. I guess I can't know for sure. But looking back, it felt as though his statement was infused with far more panic than surprise. Most people start conversations with the word hello, Ev, I answered, with a smirk that I was sure he could hear in my voice. I leaned forward, grabbing the remote from my coffee table to mute the television. The woman on the news had been talking about the very snowstorm Evan was calling me about, using words like record-breaking and unprecedented to describe it, urging people to stay in their homes. I'd heard enough, deciding I'd had my fill of bad news for the day, and rose from the couch, making my way toward the window. Yeah, hi, whatever, dude. Are you seeing this, though? Evan responded, mild annoyance bleeding into the urgency in his voice. I laughed, pulling the curtains aside as I made my way to the window. I peered out into the parking lot of my apartment complex, and I immediately understood why Evan had called. Yeah, that's a lot, I muttered, peering outside. The world outside was unrecognizable, plunged under a maelstrom of snow and ice, completely transforming the landscape. The roads outside of my apartment were almost wholly obstructed from my view, hidden under a blanket of falling snow and ice. But from what I could see, it was empty. It made sense, especially given the hazardous weather conditions, and I was glad to see people were staying safe and off the roads. But there was an eeriness to it that I was happy to have Evan distract me from. How long does this kind of stuff usually last for, man? Blizzards? It depends, I guess, I said, poring over mental images of past blizzard experiences, trying to come up with some estimate. A couple hours usually. Evan sighed, muttering nervous expletives to himself for a while before taking a deep breath. A part of me wanted to tease my friend. He was a California kid who had moved here for college, and he hated the cold as it was. It seemed to me that Colorado winters might have been more than he bargained for. I instead allowed what little maturity I had to take effect and elected to be a somewhat decent friend and tried to calm him. "You good, man?" Yeah, fine," he said, though his voice sounded far from it. I tried to sympathize with his position. He'd just seen snow for the first time earlier in the year, and without warning, I could see how a snowstorm, especially to this extent, could be frightening. And though a smaller, terrible side of me still wanted to tease him for how much he seemed to be freaking out, I mostly felt bad for him. Leaving home for college must have been tough for Evan, the loneliness contributing much anxiety in his first few months here, and I could only imagine it was made worse isolated at home in the storm. "It's gonna be okay, dude. Trust me," I started, admittedly unsure of what to say. "I know, Mom," he responded with his usual sarcasm, pausing for a moment. "Damn, dude, it's just, I've never seen anything like it." I furrowed my brow, an involuntary frown creeping onto my face. It wasn't like Evan to be so nervous. He was notorious among our group of friends for his boldness. Evan didn't care. He'd do what he wanted and let the consequences follow as they might. Sometimes he seemed brave, other times just stupid. But this was entirely out of character for him. "Look, listen," I started, combing my mind for some reassuring comment, some words to quell the sudden and unexplainable feeling of discomfort Evan's call had stirred in me. I couldn't understand his panic, though I had to admit it was slightly contagious. "It's no different than any other storm. Literally, just stay inside and you've got no real problem," I said, making an effort not to sound as though I was talking down to him. There was a long pause, and for a moment I questioned whether the call had been dropped. As if in response, Evan broke the silence with a long, deliberate sigh. "Thanks, Andrew," he muttered. "For real." His statement rang with a surprising sincerity, as if my poor attempt to calm him truly meant a lot to him. I appreciated it, but it only served to exasperate the weirdness of the entire situation, which I so desperately wanted to quell. "No problem, Ev," I began. "How about we fire up the PlayStations and just mess about until this is over?" Yeah, okay." I stayed on the phone with him as we turned our attention away from the weather and towards video games. "So, what are we playing?" I asked, grabbing the remote of my game console and sinking back into the couch. Evan didn't reply. I waited for a few moments, expectation slowly morphing into confusion. Evan? Sorry, man, Evan started, his voice quickly tapering off. "Evan, are you alright? You're starting to worry me a bit. Like, actually worry." There was a pause, followed by the shuffling sounds of movement from Evan's end of the line, before his distracted reply. Yeah, I'm fine. It's just..." Again, he trailed off. I sat up in my seat, suddenly quite unable to relax as I waited for Evan to finish his sentence, or to say anything. I thought I heard something out there." Evan spoke slowly, increasing suspicion audible in every word. "Heard what? Where?" I questioned. Evan's area was a sparsely populated, nondescript little area just outside of town, and it was hard to imagine anyone outside in this weather. "The side of the house, maybe a coyote or something? Do we have those here?" he said, That and much more. If there's one thing we have, it's extensive wildlife, and you live right along a forest." He paused, considering my statement for a moment, before quickly suggesting we continue on with our game. It was clear that Evan was still worried, still scared. Scared of the blizzard, or the noises he said he heard. I wasn't sure. But he wasn't okay. That much was clear to me. Still, I knew Evan. There was nothing I could say to him that would serve as a better distraction than some good old simulated violence. So I agreed, and we ended the call. I returned to my couch, putting on the gaming headset my friends had peer pressured me into buying, awaiting an invitation to Evan's game chat. I sat back, my mind drifting involuntarily back to Evan's call. On the surface, there was nothing outwardly too strange about it. Still, I found myself staring outside, my mind lost in that blizzard, in the vast nothingness. I shivered, attempting to swallow down the constricting feeling of claustrophobia. A sudden voice in my ear made my heart drop into a pit in my chest, panic shooting through me. "Hey," Evan called from over the headset. Relief rushed through me, outpaced only by silent embarrassment and my fearfulness. "What are we playing?" I asked, trying to stifle the slight shake in my voice as my heart rate returned to normal. We spent a few minutes finding a game, and almost an hour after that, racing around virtual worlds in an effort to ignore our own. The game served the purpose of distraction. For me at least, perhaps a little too well. I was focused on the racing simulator we were playing, and my anxiety from Evan's call had almost entirely faded from the forefront of my thoughts. Had I been paying more attention, I would have sooner noticed how quiet Evan had gotten. I frowned, realizing it had been a while since he'd last spoken in the game chat. As if he had heard my thoughts, Evan spoke, his words both confusing and scaring me. "I think there's someone out there, dude." Something. The words seemed to hang there for a brief moment as I searched dumbly for a response. To be completely honest, I've always been close to useless in stressful situations, and the one at hand was one I was not at all prepared for. It didn't matter. Evan spoke again before the silence could settle. "I've been trying to ignore this man, but for the entire time we've been playing, I've heard sounds outside in the forest. At first, they kind of blended with the wind, and it was easier to ignore," he began, speaking with a panicked quickness. "But that's not the wind, and it's sure as hell no coyote," Evan said with grave seriousness. I lowered the controller, the game no longer a pressing concern for either of us, and crossed the living room, resting against the wall nearest the window. The elements had conspired to put on a show, it seemed. The snow falling in seemingly endless amounts made only worse by the powerful winds that had turned it into a violent flurry. I was beginning to understand how someone could find the experience disquieting, perhaps even terrifying. "What are you hearing, Evan?" I was met with footsteps from Evan's end, followed by the sound of an opening window. When Evan spoke, it was to breathe a single word. "Listen." I waited, hearing only the roar of wind in my headphones. I pictured Evan leaning forward with his headset sticking out of the window, and almost laughed at the absurdity of the image. As I opened my mouth to comment, to make some tension-diffusing joke, I began to hear something. The sounds were faint at first, rendered nearly inaudible as the blizzard raged on, and I strained myself to make out what exactly I was hearing. I squinted, the sound slowly coming into focus over the noise of the snowstorm. Slowly, I began to understand what I was hearing. Voices. Several of them by the sounds of it. All were growing less and less faint. All moving closer and closer. "Are those Are there people out there? I asked my question, one of genuine shock and confusion. I couldn't understand why or how anyone could be out there right now, and especially in Evan's neighborhood, which was much more densely forested than my own. It sounds like it, he muttered, keeping his voice low as we listened. As awful as it may sound, I wanted to hang up. The feeling of dread that was beginning to dawn on me in those moments was like nothing I'd ever felt before, as something inside me began to scream out a warning to me. This is wrong. I swallowed, gritting my teeth as the voices drew nearer. Do you see anyone? I asked him, not sure what answer I wanted to receive. No, he muttered. It's a blizzard. I can barely see anything, man. This is freaking me out. I sympathized with Evan's words, feeling much the same myself, although I knew I shouldn't relay that information to him. The strange instinct still gnawed at me, some part of me wanting very much for Evan to leave, to get away from his home, away from whatever strange folk may be traversing the woods at this time. I racked my brain, unsure of what to say. Evan spoke before I could. His words, hurried and panicked, only served to worsen the emerging sense of dread I was feeling. I can hear them, man. I can hear them talking out there. They're coming closer. I don't know, man. Call someone. I started, utterly unsure of what to say. None of it made sense. Who would be out there in the forest during a storm like this? I stared out into the snowy beyond and shivered at the thought of people just beyond the glass, staring back. Evan gave a sarcastic laugh. Call who? The cops? And say what? He asked, anger rising in his voice. 911, I think I hear people walking through the woods. That's not exactly a crime, man. Plus, nobody's on my property as far as I can tell. I recoiled at the anger in his voice, though I understood fear was responsible for it. I guess you're right. I don't know what to say. I sighed, lamenting my inability to help my best friend. I heard him sigh, likely regretting the outburst. I'm sorry, man. His voice broke, and he took another breath, taking some time to compose himself before finishing. Very, very freaked. I get it. To be completely honest, me too. This all feels very weird to me, I replied honestly. I wanted to help Evan in some way, to find some yet unseen solution that would dispel the strangeness of the night, but all I could do in the current situation was sympathize and try not to let him feel alone. I'm just going to close the window and, I don't know, I'll leave the lights on so the house looks more occupied, Evan said, though I could tell the idea did very little to comfort him. Makes sense. You still want to play more after? Nah, he murmured, his voice dispirited. Not really in the mood. Yeah, I understand. I'll call you. Cool. And with that, Evan ended the game chat. I sighed, lowering my head into my palms, my mind littered with concerns. I was worried about more than just the strange people heard wandering Evan's forest, but Evan himself. The situation seemed to be wearing on his mental condition significantly, something that I knew wasn't good for him. I found myself thinking while awaiting his call, memories like dry tinder stoking the fires of worry in my mind. I thought of a game we played a few months prior, after one too many joints, swapping of stories to see who had the most traumatic experience. It was a silly, morbid idea, but that was the kind of stupid thing we did. I'd given him a spirited and emotional telling of discovering my girlfriend had cheated on me in high school, which I finished with some extra dramatic flair. Evan had chuckled at my story, muttering a nice in appreciation of my delivery before responding with tales of his struggles. I don't feel it's my place to say too much about exactly what he went through, The very least I can give him is that basic human privacy. Still, in a broad sense, Evan had struggled with depression, anxiety, and a myriad of related afflictions from a young age, and it hadn't been easy. By the story of his third hospitalization, I was silent, staring dumbly as I searched for some answer, some words I could say to express my sympathy. I remember the silence lasting a moment as Evan took another long puff of his joint. When he exhaled, smoke obscuring his face for a moment, he chuckled, which quickly became a cough. He spoke a few seconds later, a sly grin on his face as he muttered, "Guess I win." I laughed softly under my breath, though an expanding sense of melancholy began to consume what little I found funny about the conversation. My best friend had been through enough in life, burdened with so much over his relatively short life. I prayed to whatever was listening that night he would not be afflicted with more. I sat on the edge of the couch, glancing at my phone. 8:32, the time read. Evan still hadn't called, and I was beginning to feel the weight of the stress, mental exhaustion from the events of the day taking effect as sleep began to tug at the corners of my consciousness and pull my mind adrift. I swiftly fell into sleep. I was startled awake by the blare of my ringtone, a cold shock ripping through my body as I jolted awake. I cursed myself for the volume of my ringtone, which I never remembered to put down after taking my headphones out. I no longer felt that way as the screen of my phone came to life. The final ring of the phone chimed through the air, gone before I could react, and I saw the time. 9:30. My heart froze, and as I saw the notifications, it fell entirely. 16 missed calls, 29 messages, 7 voicemails, all from the same person. Evan. Damn it, I spat, sitting upward with such force it made me dizzy as I grabbed my phone and immediately clicked Evan's call notifications. The phone rang and rang and rang, every second allowing the agonizing anticipation to bloom larger until it felt as though the sensation would make me burst. Come on, I begged into the line, as if my words would carry across the signal an answer for him. Finally, on what felt as though it would have been the final ring, the call was answered. I waited for some response, but heard only silence from Evan's end. As I listened closer, I began to realize in the quiet there was breathing. Evan? I called into the line, no longer making any attempt to conceal my panic. Evan's breathing grew louder. When he spoke, his voice was low and quivering, unrecognizable from the outwardly bold and brash attitude that was typical of him. He sounded scared for his life. They're everywhere, he rasped, desperation hanging to every word. They're all around the house, surrounding the house, all of them, out there in the snow. His words chilled me to my core as I struggled to make sense of what he was saying. Evan, are you being attacked? The words came as my mind pieced together what was being said. I see them. Evan spoke with a raspiness in his voice that hadn't been present in the calls before. See who, Evan? Who's out there? My heartbeat was deafening in my own head as the images of masked men emerging from the snow, forcing their way into Evan's home, armed with weapons and evil intent, filled my mind. They don't know it, but I can see them, all standing out there, standing in the snow. There's so many of them, Andrew. I swallowed, a strange new fear taking root as Evan's manic speech continued, and I began to wonder just what had happened while I slept. What had driven him to this state? I'd had enough, and I needed an answer. I needed to know what was going on. Evan, I need a straight answer right now. Is someone breaking into your house? Do I need to call the police? I don't know what I expected to hear in response. Evan laughed. Cackled is a more appropriate term. It was short and harsh, but when he spoke, his voice was hollow, hopeless. The police? He said the words as though it was the first time he'd ever heard of such a thing. You don't think I tried? I called them half an hour ago, and nothing, not even a busy signal. I blinked, trying to process what he was telling me. He had tried to call the police? Just how bad had things gone in my absence? Evan, I began, my voice strained with a forced calmness. What happened? Evan's breathing slowed as he tried to calm himself and respond. When we got off the game, I went around the house turning all the lights on like I said I would. And for a while, I just waited and listened. The house settled, the windows and walls creaked against the storm. But other than that, it was silent. The talking was gone. As Evan proceeded, the hairs on my back slowly began to rise, and I felt compelled to close my curtains, the continual barrage of white feeling as though it was closing in, pressing ever closer. He continued. I thought whoever was out there had left, and that I could just worry about this damn blizzard. But they just wanted me to feel safe, to lower my guard. With every word Evan spoke, the deepening chasm of dread that had formed in me widened. My mouth felt dry, and my head pounded with fear for my friend's well-being. Evan rattled on, his delivery growing faster and less articulate by the second, manic excitement evident in his voice. They were everywhere, Andrew, banging on the doors and the windows and the damn roof, screaming and pleading and begging and promising and... His voice broke, followed by low sobbing from his end. Something in me shattered as I heard my best friend begin to cry. His sobs were deep and hopeless. When he spoke, somehow, the loneliness rang out in his voice like a bell, hollow and cold. They want me to come outside, Andrew. They want me to join them in the snow. There are so many. Can you hear them? Do not go out there, Evan. I had no idea what may await him outside in the storm, but every fibre of my being screamed for me to warn him, plead for him to stay in the house. There was a repetitive series of slamming noises echoing from all around Evan, who muttered to himself inaudibly. Images sprang to my mind as I began to understand what I was hearing. Armies of figures moving through the snow, surrounding Evan's home, which stood with light pouring from its windows like some strange lighthouse in the vast white nothingness. Droves of shadows spilled from the surrounding woods, under cover of darkness and concealed by snow, driving their fists into the windows and walls of the house. Evan! I called into the phone, raising my voice as the sounds around him seemed to grow in their intensity and violence. His response was almost impossible to hear above the surrounding clamour, and I had to strain myself to make out what he was saying. His voice was faint, just above a whisper, was filled with something I hadn't heard from him all night. Some strange, delirium-fueled joy. It sounds nice out there. They all sound so happy. I could feel it in those few words. I knew that Evan was lost to me. Still, I refused to give up. Moisture sprang into my eyes as an impending sense of loss began to wash over me. From the other end, I heard the sound of a door open, followed by the roar of rushing wind. I knew what he was doing. I knew that I was too late, that whatever was out there had firmly planted its hooks in Evan's mind, that my friend was already gone to me, lost to the blizzard, like the voices that called to him. "I'm sorry, man," Evan spoke. The unnatural calm in his voice seemed alien against the cacophony of sounds on his end. "I have to go." Whoever, or whatever surrounded his home, began to cheer and whoop and holler as Evan brought himself closer and closer to the doorway. A captive and encouraging audience. I didn't know what else to say. I believe this was when he stepped out. The roar of the storm grew louder, ringing in my ears as if I'd stepped out into the blizzard myself. The cheers and cries of the otherworldly crowd disappeared with such suddenness I would have thought the call had ended had it not been for the howling of the wind. "Andrew? Damn, why am I out here? Jesus, it's freezing!" He spoke again, with sudden fear and lucidity. My heart leapt at hearing Evan speak again, sounding like himself, though confused and horrified at his current situation. I had no time to explain things to Evan, who seemed to have forgotten leaving his house, knowing that whatever had caused his strange behavior was still out there. "Get in the house, Evan! There's something out there!" "Jesus, I see them," Evan spoke, his voice shaking with some fusion of awe and horror. "Evan, please go," I said through gritted teeth, filled with hopeless frustration. I'm sorry, bud," Evan muttered, sounding resigned to a fate I refused to accept. "I think they're taking me now." Before I could speak, there was a sound, deafening even over the speakers of my phone, a mechanical echo reverberating from all around him. My head pounded. The strange sound, like some mechanized explosion, was gone, leaving silence in its wake. I don't know how long I sat there, dazed, some part of me hoping to hear Evan's voice break through the complete silence. As the seconds stretched into minutes and the fleeting hope became a distant memory, I began to take notice of just how quiet it was. I rushed to the window, pulling the curtains aside, reaffirming my realization. The storm had ended. With no more warning than it had arrived, the powerful winds had returned to a frigid breeze, and the world, no longer concealed under the blizzard, lay eerily still and silent under a fresh coat of snow. I couldn't help but feel that the timing was all too perfect. I called the police soon after. I told them the truth and fully prepared to be scrutinized, perhaps even accused of playing some role in Evan's disappearance. It was a strange, impossible story that I was reluctant to tell. I'll never forget the looks in the eyes of the officers who'd arrived at the apartment to question me. They looked exhausted and afraid. And as I began to dive into the events of the night, the looks they exchanged between each other led me to believe that Evan's incident may not have been an isolated one. "This isn't the first call we've gotten like that tonight," the shorter and slightly rounder officer started, pausing to cast a nervous glance over his shoulder. "It's been real weird tonight. A lot of interesting stories seem to blow in with this storm. People seeing lights in the sky, strange markings in the snow." He shivered as a rogue breeze seemed to freeze in the air. He appeared all too eager to return to the safety of his cruiser, and I couldn't blame him. I too was suddenly feeling very exposed. The taller of the two officers cleared his throat abruptly, shooting his partner a strange look before turning its attention back to me. "We'll look into it," the larger of the two said, a scowl seemingly carved into his face. "In the meantime, I'd stay inside," he began, his eyes seeming to stare through me. Strange weather. Best to be safe. I swallowed. The way he spoke made it clear that it wasn't the weather I should be worried about. The shorter officer bid me a farewell, and the two were gone. I stood there for a few moments longer, watching the cruiser disappear into the distance, leaving me alone. I stared out at the silent, snow-covered world around me for a few moments, my mind somewhere out by the nearby mountains, until my eyes drifted from the snowy peaks to the stars above. I stayed like that for a while, the events of earlier all replaying in my mind, until it had gotten too cold to remain there for any longer, and returned to my apartment. I no longer live in Colorado. In fact, I moved as far away from the snow as I could manage, transferring to a school in Texas. Still, when the nights get too quiet and the air takes on just the right sort of chill, my ghosts return, and I can't help but wonder about it all. I spend many nights in bed, strange and impossible conclusions being born of what little information I have, a constant series of discovery and dispute in my mind. Often, as my consciousness begins to fade, I can hear voices in my dreams, calling from wintry forests. The loudest among them is Evan's.